Hello and welcome. I'm Miguel Padro, Assistant Director at the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program. On behalf of Aspen BSP, thank you very much for joining us today. Today's conversation is about trends in the US job market that have been a fixture on front pages for months. They've even been given pithy names like the Great Resignation and Striketober and She Session. The catchy hashtags say something, but they only illuminate sections of a big picture. The Great Resignation, or as some are calling it, the Great Reshuffle, is far from a simple story. It is being experienced differently across industry, age, gender, race, economic class, education levels. It's being experienced differently by parents and caregivers versus young people just entering the workforce. And for all of those differences, there are probably also some common threads that everyone's experiencing, which are also, we think, worth identifying. And we can't trace all of these threads in our hour today, but we can get at some of those threads, and we have some wonderfully insightful panelists to help us do that. Before I welcome our panelists and moderator to the screen, I should mention that we will dedicate time to audience questions, and those can be submitted using the Q&A button. Our conversation is being recorded today, and we will post links to full bios of our panelists in the chat. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Scott Tong, co-host of NPR's Here and Now, and our panelists, Mahlet, Getachew, Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink, Cydney, Roach, Global Chair of Employee Experience at Edelman, and Dania, Rajendra, the inaugural director of the coalition, Athena. Welcome all of you. Scott, take it away.
Miguel, thank you, and thanks to your Aspen team, including Rachel, for putting together a great event and a great panel. In a moment, I'll say hello to our panel members and ask them to introduce themselves briefly and their perspective on this. First of all, here's how we're going to spend the hour. I will very briefly set the table with a couple numbers and some narratives about this so-called Great Resignation. And then I'll ask panelists to talk about their own views. And we'll talk for maybe half an hour or so, and that will leave a good 20 minutes or so for your questions before we're done. Very briefly, let me kind of set the table and then get out of the way. A few numbers on this phenomenon, for which we're still trying to figure out the appropriate hashtag, as Miguel's described. The so-called quit rate of people voluntarily leaving their jobs hit 3% of all workers in the country back in September, all-time high. The labor force is about 4 million workers less than before the pandemic. Of those leaving the workforce, about half are early retirees, according to the Fed Bank of St. Louis. The highest resignation rates are among mid-career workers between the ages of 30 and 45. That's from Harvard Business School. And surveys of workers during the pandemic turn up anxiety about a number of things that are feeding into this. Anxiety about COVID, about childcare, about burnout among frontline workers, about lack of growth opportunities, and about a desire to find employers with certain values consistent with the workers' values. So what's going on? Let me throw out a few narratives bouncing around the conversation and then ask our panelists to weigh in. Among the narratives, that this is about workers confronting their mortality and reevaluating their lives and their work. This is about a long-term structural decline in the workforce. That this is a temporary pandemic thing that will ease when the pandemic, fingers crossed, eases. That this is largely about early retirements for higher wage workers. And that this is about workers without college degrees, lower wage workers who are concerned about their health and their health care. As Miguel said, clearly how you see it depends where you sit, which brings me to a great panel of people who see this from different perspectives. And I'm gonna kind of go to them now. So I'll ask each of you to initially speak briefly. Please introduce yourself, describe a little bit about what you do, and then diagnose how you frame this. How do you think we got here? So Mahlet, Getachew at PolicyLink, let me ask you to go first. Go ahead and introduce yourself and go.
Thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all today to discuss the Great Resignation and the future of work. As Scott mentioned, or Miguel mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of Corporate Racial Equity at PolicyLink. And for those of you that do not know PolicyLink, we're a national research and action institute based in Oakland, California. For over 2 decades, PolicyLink has been building and leading the racial and economic equity movement in America, dedicated to amplifying the expertise and the resilience of people of color and low-income communities in order to remake our social and economic systems to work for all of us, not just some of us. And our guiding ethos in everything that we do is equity. And that means the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all of us can participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. Now, my background is as a business lawyer. I've spent most of my career advising large and small companies across various industries, started my career as a mergers and acquisitions attorney at a large international law firm in Silicon Valley, and then went in-house for many years at various tech companies. Most recently, before PolicyLink, I was the general counsel of a healthcare technology company in Silicon Valley. And in the summer of 2020, as America, and really the globe, was in the midst of a long overdue reckoning with racial injustice, I had a personal reckoning of my own. After 13 years as a corporate lawyer, I decided we need to have a shared language, we need a shared approach, we need a new way in the private sector to really meaningfully address racial equity. And we have to be in locked arms together on what is clearly one of the greatest moral, economic, and democratic imperatives of our time. So I shifted my career, joined PolicyLink to focus on the intersection of business and racial equity. And when I think of the Great Resignation, I think of myself. It's very personal to me. Now my work focuses on igniting the racial equity movement more broadly and deeply in the business and investor communities, and building those pathways for the anti-racist and equitable business leadership we need today to meet the scale of the challenges before us. That includes thought leadership, strategic guidance for business leaders, research and supporting the legal reform that we need to bring about more equitable business practices. And most importantly, right now, my work focuses on developing robust corporate performance standards on racial equity to show the way forward for business leaders across sectors. Now, the Great Resignation underscores the importance to me of advancing racial and economic equity in our nation. So I'm very excited to dive into this topic, and I'll start now by sharing my perspective of how we got here. First, this moment is ironic for a number of reasons, and that shouldn't be lost on us. The first irony is that at the early stages of the pandemic, workers we know were forced to leave involuntarily, right? Mass terminations and layoffs. But now with the Great Resignation, workers are leaving voluntarily. The same groups that were the most physically and economically vulnerable during the pandemic have remained the most vulnerable. And yet we're still choosing to leave despite the economic risk. That's frontline workers, women, and workers of color across the board, whether people come from professionally privileged or financially precarious career backgrounds. They're making mass exodus. And this pandemic has caused workers of color especially to reflect on our own mortality and desire to lead more dignified lives. And it's unfortunate that the next natural step for so many of us has been to just resign and tap out. Another irony around this is that we've been here before. This week marks the anniversary of mass worker strikes that happened in the mid-1940s, centered on the very same things that are still at issue today: better wages, better working conditions, the desire to organize into unions to have more bargaining power. History is repeating itself. That seems to happen so often. But in that repetition, I think we have a huge opportunity. So how did we get here? Why is history still repeating itself? 4 reasons from my perspective. 1, all jobs need to be humanizing as opposed to dehumanizing. Workers no longer want to be treated like cogs in an impersonal business machine. It's time to let go of that myth of lazy and uncivil workers who can only be motivated through abuses of power or through hoarding power and fear of financial insecurity. That's huge. People are tired of being treated like they don't have intrinsic value as humans, and like the only value we bring is our labor. If business leaders we know are good to their employees, employees will be productive for companies, and employers can take far more action in this area around having family supporting wages, wealth building opportunities, safe and predictable hours, professional development opportunities, and financial wellness literacy and programs. Another area that tells me, that says a lot about why we're here today, and I know, Cydney, you're going to talk much more about this, but it's about trust. Workers don't trust their managers and business leaders after years of failed efforts on especially diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we need to take to heart that we cannot keep failing on that. We need to achieve results. And the way to rebuild trust there is to be more vulnerable and transparent. I know how hard that is as a former general counsel, to be more open about the challenges you're having as a company, but that is the key, in my view, in rebuilding trust and retaining especially diverse talent, and also achieving results on DEI instead of being comfortable continuing to fail and not achieving results. Third, we're also here because workers want increased power and voice. Period. I talked a little bit about that in the ironies, but really we need more power and voice for workers. And we have a publication that we came out with this past summer called the CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity. And in the blueprint, we talk a lot about how to expand worker power and voice, including allowing workers to unionize and so many other actions. Lastly, workers today, we want to know that we're working for companies that are doing good and that are not harming. Leaders need to understand that we are not the same as we were before the pandemic. And we know that there are so many global challenges before us. And we want to know that the companies we're working for are really contributing to solutions and not part of the problem.
Mahlet, thank you very much for that. Let me turn it over to Cydney. Cydney Roach at Edelman. Again, tell her briefly what your work is and how did we get here?
So thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to this great audience today. I'm the Global Chair of Employee Experience at Edelman. We advise clients on the people dimension of business transformation, and Edelman also conducts annual global research on societal trust, and the latest piece of research is on the belief-driven employee. So how do I think we got here? I'm going to start back in the Jack Welch age and the Milton Keynesian economics age, and then spring forward to 2008. And I think that economic downturn caused employers to start managing quarter to quarter. As Lawrence Fink said in his letter on purpose to his shareholders, we have to take a longer view. We have to be purpose-led, purpose being defined as a strategy, purpose is a long-term expression of strategy. So when employees, when companies started to manage quarter to quarter, who took the hit? When you manage by cutting costs to try to say that is profit, who took the brunt of that? And that was the employee. So employees today are doing the jobs of 2 or 3 roles pre-2008. What does that mean when the pandemic hit? As social scientists tell us, and we've done a lot of research with Stanford University, social scientists tell us that in this time of a pandemic, of 9/11, of Black Swan events, people revert to their first principles, whether that's values, beliefs, whatever they prioritize, that's how they want to frame their life going forward. So I think that this has been a perfect storm that's led to the Great Resignation. I would reframe the question of mortality and say it's not how, it's how we want to live. We're understanding how we take those first principles and apply them to our lives and to our jobs.
Great, thank you. And Cydney, you were talking in our session before. Can I ask you to talk briefly about some of your own findings in your surveys about a little bit more about workers and what is driving their decisions?
So 1 in 5 are planning to quit or have quit their jobs in the past 6 months. 76% say they are doing that because they expect much more from their employers. 1 in 3 have left solely because They feel their employer has not taken important stance on social issues. And now 7 in 10 are expecting their employer to directly connect them to social impact via their jobs. This is an overwhelming expectation that people want to feel that their jobs can be the conduit then to lead to more societal good, and they are trusting. It's ironic because there's never been a higher level of trust between employer and business as an institution, but particularly the trust between, you know, an employer and my CEO. They have this very, very, very high expectation right now, a very, very high trust level, but with that high trust comes super high expectations. And that's the needle that employers have to thread right now to take advantage of that and to listen and to become more employee-centric, or else they're going to risk alienating people further in the Great Resignation.
Great. And 5-second question, what is the general profile of a worker who responds to this survey? What field, what income level?
Yeah, so the methodology for that is global research. It's been in 7 countries. I'll put a link in this chat for the research. It's available online. 7 countries. It represents a great demographic of workers. We did not do a deep racial cut, but we're going to try to do that in the January refresh.
Generally white collar workers as a rule?
No, we did not divide by frontline or desk bound workers, but what we did was segment by salary levels, which tends to sort of fall out with frontline workers, middle management, and white collar.
Okay, great, thank you. No, so these numbers are, as you're describing, kind of across the board, across these different types of workers. Dania Rajendra, thank you for joining us. Tell us about the workers you work with and your diagnosis of how we got here, please.
Sure. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Miguel and Aspen, and it's great to be with you, Mahlet and Cydney and Scott, and all y'all who are participating with us. So I am a worker who has a job that helps advance social good in the way that apparently lots and lots of people want to have a job like this. So I recommend it. I was the inaugural director of Athena, which is a newish 2-year-old coalition tackling the dangers that Amazon poses to our democracy and economy. I came to that work with 2 decades of organizing and advocating for racial and economic justice. Athena is a coalition of more than 50 US-based NGOs, the first in a generation multi-issue national coalition tackling the many permutations of the problem that Amazon represents and galvanizing the many constituencies necessary to make this kind of change. Workers, owners of independent business, neighbors, privacy advocates, racial justice activists, and policy advocates at every level, local, state, and federal, on a number of different issues, from environmental protections to worker safety to surveillance to antitrust, just to name a few. And Scott, I think when I think like, how did we get here?
Yeah.
For us, or I think for racial and economic justice advocates, COVID and the 2020 racial justice uprisings reveal what workers, neighbors, organizers, and scholars have been saying about our economy for decades. Neoliberalism shifts the most risk to the most vulnerable, and that's what we see sort of revealed by COVID. The American workplace, by and large, enforces this risk shift. Obviously, not all workplaces, but lots of them. And I'm really talking in generalities about the culture of work in our country. For low-wage workers, especially low-wage workers of color, in particular, especially Black, Latinx, and Native workers, COVID made their reality undeniable to everyone. That reality is, if you work in meatpacking, in warehousing, in retail, or in food service, especially if you work for a large corporation, the people who own your company and a loud minority of your customers are acting as if your death is an acceptable cost of doing business. It is nearly impossible to draw any other conclusion from the last couple of years. This is not just about the workplace. This is about the fundamental lack of social supports for working people in our country. Anyone who has tried to prepare lunch, or perhaps is trying to prepare lunch for another human being while also trying to be on a Zoom call, can probably relate to this lack of supports. These policies and these cultures do often define work in the United States today. The Professor Elizabeth Anderson calls this a private government, that American workspaces are despotic, tyrannical, and dangerous. These are harsh words, and maybe you're not used to hearing advocates talk about the workplace that way. But I think in Cydney's research and in so much of what I know of Mahlet's work, like, we're seeing that people are responding to some element of that and trying to find a different way to live a better, and as Mahlet said, a more dignified life. It's not limited to Amazon or big tech or even to retail. These corporations are not only employers, they're actors in our society at large, worsening racism, sexism, the information ecology, and literally our climate. It's a lot, and it's scary to me as a person who's been doing this work for 2 decades, that our public governance is looking more and more like our workplaces, rather than better functioning democracy happening in both public policy and the workplace as well. But it's not all doom and gloom. There's amazing ongoing solidarity. I'm excited to talk about people coming together across all kinds of lines of difference to build the kind of economy that supports the kind of democracy that it sounds like from Cydney's research and from Mahlet's work that so many of us want to live in.
Great, Dania, thank you. And we will move in a few minutes to talk more about policy questions and takeaways that you think the business community should derive from this moment here. Let me stay with you, Dania, to pose the next question. And maybe if I'm hoping each of you can kind of dispense with this quickly, even though it's a big question. You have talked about a number of ingredients leading up to where we are. The model of American capitalism, the culture of American work, the racial reckoning that this country is undergoing right now, the situation for workers at the leading edge of risk in this pandemic. So the question is this moment a turning point for workers? Is this a moment of empowerment where actually something might actually change? Dania, let me go to you first.
Well, I sure hope so. One of the things,
sure, but I'm asking, I guess, for your reality check of this.
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the things that working on the problems of Amazon taught me is that it's really facile and incorrect, but super common, to conflate wages and worker power. That's not helpful. Wages are simply not a proxy for power. Policy and policy enforcement, which I know we're going to talk more about later, but I do think that that's a much more useful way to think about power. Wages are going up for some workers, and that is fabulous and wonderful and long overdue. But wage policy is not going up. The tip minimum wage has been stuck at $2.13 since the early 1990s. And I wore those fashions in the early 1990s the first time. So I feel like personally entitled to say that was a long, long time ago. And I think that, so we're not talking about what wages would be if they had kept pace with inflation, which is something like $26 an hour. We're still fighting for 15. But it's really not about wages so much when we think about worker power and a time of change. I think many Amazon workers make $15 or more, but they can't get the corporation to follow its own policies and time off. As the New York Times reported not so long ago, African-American workers connected to Athena organizing have likened those warehouses to plantation slavery. A formerly incarcerated worker told The Guardian it was worse than prison. Those are not about wages. Those are about working conditions. To switch gears from Amazon, like I suspect most, if not most, Activision Blizzard workers, for example, make more than 15, but despite 2 walkouts, a high-profile resignation, an SEC investigation, and like top-notch reporting from the Wall Street Journal, the CEO in charge of a culture of sexual harassment and discrimination is still the boss, and the board is still backing him. There are too many things.
Dania, forgive me for
Sure.
for jumping in. I mean, I hear more very compelling explanations that this to you seems like a ripe moment for this policy conversation to happen, that it should happen. Before I turn to Cydney, do you think it will happen, honestly?
I think what we're living through right now is a question of whether it can happen. I think Cydney's research and Mahlet's work, and certainly what we learn as organizers, is that people don't want to live in this economy. And I think some of the numbers you started with, Scott, show that people who can vote with their feet are voting with their feet. And let's be honest, those of us who are higher income earners have options that low wage workers simply don't have, right? And I think, like, whether we're talking about public policy or corporate policy, there seems to be a gap between popular will and the ability to implement and enforce policies that people want to live with. And if we can't solve that, that's a fundamental brokenness about democracy that I really hope we are not there now. So I'm going to continue to be hopeful and look to my other panelists to add to my optimism.
Over to Cydney, a real moment of empowerment and leverage right now?
Absolutely. I think that employees have never had, their voices never had more power. They're voting with their feet, walking out the door, certainly. But activism, activism has become the norm. 76% of the people in our survey globally said that they would take action to motivate necessary changes within their organization. 58% said they'd start with doing that within their system, working within the system, but 40% said they would not hesitate to take action, public protest, document leaking, whistleblowing, et cetera. That's a moment of empowerment. But I want to go back to, like, pre-pandemic. Let's remember that the Business Roundtable, BlackRock, they took a stand a couple of years before the pandemic, before Black Lives Matter, to say we cannot continue in this solely focused, singular stakeholder management of managing to the shareholder. It is now a multi-stakeholder capitalist society. That's a much more complex landscape to manage for leadership. And as Richard Edelman likes to say, talking about policy, Richard Edelman, at the end of every trust presentation, he ends by saying, business cannot go it alone. You have to partner with policymakers, government, media, NGOs. And I think I can give some client examples of how, we have helped do that, because in a lot of cases, in many countries, private sector has to lead. It's easier for private sector to be the catalyst for change and coalescing all of those other institutions to gather and rally around a goal, right? So we've done that with a fast food restaurant chain, a huge global one, that enabling and empowering people to have a first job, people who are traditionally unemployed, partnering with local government, partnering with NGOs, taking a paid earned owned media approach and getting media involved in that way by donating space and time. So it's possible. It's absolutely possible. I think business has a huge responsibility to lead the way in making this moment in time not just a moment in time, but it's continuing the sea change that is in front of us right now, if that tracks.
Great. Okay, same question, over to Mahlet, please.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. At times I'm very optimistic and at times I'm very pessimistic. So I'm agreeing with both of you. I think the Great Resignation is as much a crisis as it is an opportunity for radical social change. And back in the summer of 2020, I wrote just a small little post on LinkedIn exhorting my connections to take action for racial justice, because we just can't go back to normal. Feeling so deeply that the way things are working weren't working for me. And I was in a very privileged position then. And now 18 months later, it's clear to me that what felt like a fire in me has been true for so many. And what I see, in addition to the changing global sentiment, changing US sentiment that Cydney has talked about that is so important to pay attention to, there's so much cooperation happening across sectors that tells me those two reasons is that we're not going back to normal. This is not a blip on the radar. This truly is a moment of empowerment for workers, and organizations like PolicyLink and so many others are working hard with business leaders that are ready for this, with investors and so many others, to make sure that this really translates into long-lasting change for workers, where power has been shifted and where everybody has an opportunity to really reach their full potential. And I think about the past 2 years, it isn't amazing because corporations stood up and said, we're going to commit so much to changing our practices or contributing resources to racial justice. What's so remarkable is that so many of us en masse have said no to continued oppression in the workplace, in society, in our communities. And that's not going to change. We're forever changed by the pandemic and by everything we've experienced over many decades.
Mahlet, thank you. We have, sorry, but I'm gonna send it back to all of you quickly. We are getting a lot of policy questions on whether these trends of activism and empowerment have implications for policy. So now we're getting to the solutions part of this, and I do want to leave time for a specific Q&A. So Mahlet, I'll start with you. I'm going to ask each of you for two things that you want to see from public policy, from corporate management, or both. But I'm going to give you two because we got to move on. Mahlet, go please.
Oh, Scott, that's really hard. Just two things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll say on the business side and investor side, the one thing we need to see now is that workers, community members, the public, we demand results. We need results. We're in an age of accountability now, where just lip service is not good enough. And results means listening to workers at all levels for what is actually needed, because what we see so often now is that leaders are not proximate to the challenges that those that are most vulnerable or those that have been historically excluded have experienced. And so needing to listen and embody shifting power meaningfully in order to achieve results is really important. On the public policy side, my experience is in the corporate sector and the private sector. And so I think about the ways in which the SEC can play a powerful role to support business leaders to be even more impactful. I think about what corporate governance law should become. The future of corporate governance, I believe, is about greater worker power embedded within the governance of corporations. So those are the types of public policy shifts I would like to see, in addition to ensuring that we have the public policies that allow all workers in America to earn family supporting wages and to be able to build wealth.
Great. Okay, Dania, over to you. Two fixes.
Pass the voting rights protections, pass the voting rights protections, pass voting rights protections. And corporations should start to follow the law. I think Amazon getting busted for violating labor law with that mailbox and being forced to rerun the election is really just the very beginning, I hope, of actual enforcement of not just labor law, but all kinds of law, as Mahlet was just saying about.
And how do you connect voting rights legislation to this Great Resignation?
If we can't link popular sentiment to policy outcomes and enforcement, that is incredibly dangerous, not just for, questions about economic stability, but the functioning of our democracy. And I think, like, to pick up on what Mahlet was saying in the last piece, like, yes, more people than ever before in the United States in the most multiracial demonstrations of our history made clear that the majority of people want to see municipal governments shift resources from law enforcement to human needs. And yet we have seen exactly one municipality do exactly that. Something is stuck, and that's true of the workplace, and that's true in public policy, and that's super dangerous. And I think voting rights is one way to ensure that we start to unlock that.
Great. Okay, Cydney, over to you, please.
So I'm not an expert on public policy, but I am an expert on corporate and employee policies. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone and answer the question that was in the Q&A about what can HR professionals do to be a catalyst for change. So in the same way that Dania just talked about linking public sentiment, popular sentiment to worker rights, my job and what I do is linking employee sentiment to employee policy and employee value propositions. So it's never been a more exciting time to be an HR professional. And here's why, is that finally HR is getting the place at the table it deserves with the board and with the C-suite level, so to speak. So if you think about an issue like burnout is now a bottom line issue. It is having material impact on an organization. When you have 4 million people, what was it, 10, I think the Department of Labor statistics said there are now 10 million jobs that are open and not enough people to fill them, even if they all became employable. So now burnout is a bottom line board level issue. HR, what you can do is be an advocate by listening in new and different ways. Yes, you have to do employee engagement surveys, and yes, you have to do flash polls, but there are other ways to capture employee sentiment. And I can tell you more about that later. This is not a sales call, but there are other ways to capture employee sentiment because you need to understand that more deeply. Because employees are telling us they do not feel heard, they do not feel recognized. Employees, 62% say they've increased their value to their employer during the pandemic, but only half say their employer is taking burnout seriously, for example. So the ability to listen more, have that sentiment translated into policy. HR professionals, you craft the employee value proposition. All of my clients have all of their employee value proposition, their employer brand is no longer valid. The one they had 2 years ago, it's no longer valid. So taking this opportunity to craft that with true employee sentiment involved and making your organization, like Unilever does, have impact on policy, public policy. You have so much power right now.
Cydney, can I put to you a question in the chat box? Beyond the trust indicators that Edelman is gathering, what data would be valuable to gather directly from workers through surveying? How can we amplify what matters most to workers?
So I think, as I mentioned, like employee surveys are valuable, they're great, but you need to triangulate that. You need to augment that with other types of data because I believe in it. I believe in surveys, but there is a bias that says people often in employee surveys, even though they're anonymized, that people tell you what they think you want to hear. So we like to triangulate that with ethically curated, publicly available data. In the same way that we can scrape for consumer opinion on products and services, we can scrape in an ethically curated way what employees are feeling about thinking and feeling about the workplace, about their job, about their particular employer. So there are several other inputs they can have in order to inform a more comprehensive view of employee sentiment.
Okay, I'm going to move to a question on immigration. What will be, and Dania, if I can go to you first on this, and then others can certainly jump in. What will be the lasting effect of this moment on economic migration? How will more or less immigration impact U.S. worker power in the coming years?
Well, first of all, unless everyone in the world gets vaccinated, we're not going to be able to have the kinds of fundamental stability that workers here in the United States and frankly around the world seek and want. So that's one thing I would say. I would say that my observation of the international attempt to deal with the climate crisis is not inspiring so far, and that the climate is a driver of economic and climate refugees. And so I think, and I think that conflict over migration is a real danger to workers in the United States as well as around the world. And so the question about migration is not like, would US workers be better off if there were fewer people coming to the United States? It's what are the policies that ensure that everyone has a better chance to, I can't remember how you said it, Mahlet, but it was so beautiful. Like something about like survive, have the opportunity to thrive. Like this is, I think one of the things that COVID makes so clear is that this is one planet. We're all in this together. And if we don't take care of the most vulnerable, then we're all more vulnerable. And this is a pretty terrible way to live. So, and I think that part of what we see in the Great Resignation, right, is that people who have options are exercising them, and people who have so many fewer options, in particular workers of color and women and femme workers, are really trying to do the very best they can with a set of pretty gnarly, I think that's the technical term, sets of options. And so I guess that's my response to that question. And then I would finally say that, I think that while of course we're talking about workers today and the opportunity of workers to participate in solving these widespread social problems, it's also deeply unfair to leave only to people who are employed by any particular corporation the responsibility of solving the problem that corporation or that corporation, that these are widespread problems and they're not particular to any corporation. And we can't expect the million or so people who work at Amazon to solve the problems that Amazon presents us to a society any more than we can expect people who work at McDonald's to solve the problems of fast food.
Okay, so we're queuing Mahlet now. And so I would love your thoughts, number one, on this immigration question. And I can imagine if business groups see this as a structural longer-term decline in the workforce, perhaps backing policies to enhance immigration. That there's a second question I'm going to put to you from our question box. This is directly a question for you, Mahlet. For managers and leaders to respond in the way you suggest requires that they develop emotional intelligence, for instance, listening better. How best do you think this can happen in the US, let alone here in the UK? We have a viewer from far away. Mahlet, please.
Scott, so on the first point around immigration or economic migration, I'm not an immigration expert. My small contribution to that answer is that just to share that I'm a first generation immigrant, came here to the United States at the age of 6 with my parents for better economic security and safety. And I know that is such an important question for people today who can't just show up here in America anymore with ready opportunities. And so how this great resignation affects economic migration, it's a huge topic that I think would be wonderful to hear from other experts on as well. But I know it is much harder today than it has ever been before, especially for immigrants. On the question from the audience around, I think it's around EQ. How can we get leaders to respond, to develop emotional intelligence and listen better? I want to start with just how we're even thinking about that question. Leaders need to step up and be leaders. And it is, as Dania was saying, really challenging for workers at other levels when they're not in the C-suite, when they're not directors, when they're not on the outside as investors with a lot of leverage, to try to get their leaders to step up. And so I think this is also a critical moment for leaders to think about, if you're not sure what to do, if you're not spending time listening to your employees, and you're not willing to, there's a big question mark about whether your leadership is what's needed for the future of work in this nation. And so, it's hard for me to respond to that question because it tells me that someone is in a leadership position that probably should not be right now. I get the wonderful privilege to engage with business leaders and investors that are leaning in very deeply. And so to develop those skills and that increased capacity, they bring on experts externally. They don't just go towards supporting internal change makers. That's very important, but they also hire external expertise to support them on their personal journeys as well. That is just as important as taking the actions that we lay out in the blueprint and doing other things to support workers. So my answer is that the right leader if they don't have the emotional intelligence to really grasp the historic moment that we're in, and that there are a lot of leaders out there that are ready to lead right now, and we should make room for them.
Great. I'm going to ask a quick question just about the notion of the moment we're in. As you know, some economic leaders think this moment, the Great Resignation, whatever we call it, may not last very long. We've heard that from Janet Yellen. We've read that from the head of the Philadelphia Fed, that fingers crossed, when the pandemic eases, that a lot of workers will return. I know a lot of you have strong thoughts on that, but certainly on the table is the view of some that this, whatever the structural reasons for this, is a phenomenon that may pass more quickly than some of us think. Who wants to take that on?
I'm happy to just
Mahlet,
recap
sure.
a little bit of what I said around how we are forever changed, and that while I speak very personally, just based on my own experience, but also on the cooperation and partnerships that we're building at PolicyLink in our work, it baffles me that folks can even think of this moment like that. Think about what's ahead for us. By 2045, 2050, we are going to be a majority people of color nation. And when we think about what we need to achieve racial and economic equity in this nation, we need to think about how we're designing this nation for that future of America. And so we absolutely, what the Great Resignation is telling us that we need, better jobs, shifting power to workers. We need that for the future stability, the economic stability of our nation. And so it cannot be a blip on the radar if we are going to build and rebuild an economic system that is really going to serve all of us in this nation. And it's urgent as we become a majority people of color nation.
Great. To Cydney, long-term issue, temporary?
You know what? I'm going to play like this is a political debate, and I'm going to answer a different question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead and pivot. We'll allow it.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Scott. So I just wanted to quickly add on the question that you had about leaders needing to have EQ. We've done a lot of research, again, with Stanford University and a leading thinker in this area about CEO is Chief Empathy Officer, and empathy is actually a muscle you can develop. I dropped a link in the chat of an ebook that was developed in cooperation with Stanford University and Edelman on how to become a more empathic leader. So I wanted to make that everybody aware of that it's available to them. And I did not want to dodge the question that's in the chat about working for Edelman, who serves fossil fuels companies. I really wanted to make sure that you understood that, yes, there have been some people who've left Edelman because of that, but we have a very strong belief that it is an issue that is so powerful, that it is so important, that as the world's largest PR firm, and knowing that we have a strong belief that it is important for private sector, public sector, NGOs, et cetera, to be part of the conversation, we cannot dodge the conversation. We can actually be a catalyst by being part of that conversation. I'm privy to some of the work we do for fossil fuels company. I can tell you that my colleagues have been incredible catalysts for change about shifting mindsets inside those organizations. The last thing I wanted to say about that is that, you know, it doesn't just stop with fossil fuels. We're so committed to ESG, but if you looked at the health sector, if the health sector was a country, it would be the 5th largest polluter because of all the single-use items it has. If you looked at the food and beverage sector, it has similar challenges because of single-use pollutants, et cetera. So it's not, we want to stay in the conversation. We want to work from the inside and be catalysts. So I really did not want anybody to think I was dodging that question. So thank you, Scott, for letting me divert.
Scott,
yeah,
I'm going to revert to form. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Dania. Yeah, and if you can dispense as efficiently as you can, because I would love to squeeze in one more quick question before we hand it back over to Miguel. Dania, go ahead.
Let me see if I could do that. I don't think that this is a short-term phenomenon, because I think it is in fact a revelation of long-term phenomena, right? Neoliberalism's not new, and I think the policy choices that people are making now, public policymakers and private policymakers now, are going to determine how much space we have for our future. So neo-feudalism is a legit possible option. That is the reality that some folks live. The kinds of futures that Mahlet's talking about are a legit possible option, but if we're going to have them, we're going to need some significant shifts. Yes, you know, so that's I think the reality is low wage workers in particular have been living at the intersection of these problems for so long, and we have seen so little shift for them in the course of this in a positive direction. And so if we're going to see real worker power, it's because workers are going to take it, and workers are going to take it by working directly with the communities that they're a part of, to exercise that politically in our democratic system. And if the system can't account for that, then we're going to have bigger problems.
Final question to all of you, and I'm going to set my clock for 1 minute. Dania, where do you have hope?
Cross-class and cross-racial alliances and solidarity give me hope. Athena for All gives me hope, and the Voting Rights Act, the PRO Act, and the anti-monopoly legislation before Congress all give me hope, as is rerunning that union election in Bessemer, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mahlet, where is your hope?
My hope is very similar to what Dania mentioned. It's the cooperation that we're seeing cross-sector. I'm seeing more and more investors think about how to have impact, not just thinking about impact investing as a separate asset class. And hearing investors start to adopt the words and the ways of pushing companies that workers also want. When those two come together, I think is going to be very exciting. So that's what brings me hope, is that more and more of us are saying the same things and working together.
Great, thank you. Cydney.
Worker voice gives me hope. If you think about the recent institutional investor trust survey that we did, institutional investors said the worker, the top talent and the worker voice is more important in their trust and to invest in a company than the ability of a company to attract new customers or to achieve a high multiple on a deal. I have very, very high hopes because of worker voice, because of that. And the other is gender equity, getting more women in leadership roles and on the board.
Great. Well, appreciate all of your thoughts very much. This is my turn to turn it over to Miguel for a last word, a last observation. Over to you.
Wow, thank you all. Really, really powerful. Lots to digest in this conversation, as we knew there would be. And I guess I would just end by with a note of hope and maybe encouragement for anyone who has been listening. That clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and clearly there's a lot of great things that can happen if we do the work. So I think that's probably the note that I'm ending on myself as we're closing out here. Just that I think it's time to experiment and really get to work doing things, building empathy, as Cydney mentioned, and listening better to each other, and creating more structures and opportunities for worker voice to influence decision-making, accountability, and strengthen our economy. I really appreciate everyone for taking the time today. Cydney, Mahlet, Dania, Scott, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening. We really look forward to seeing you again very soon. Be well.